We need to have a standardized of pharmaceutical reps.
The people that provide education, the doctors.
Who is the chairman and CEO.
The fascination the public has. The impact on society, the impact on unemployment.
One of the biggest breakthroughs of the last decade has been the advent of immunotherapy.
Welcome, everyone, to today's podcast sponsored by the ACMA. I'm really excited to have with us today Heather McKenzie. Welcome, Heather, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really excited to have you, Heather. So just a little bit of a background on Heather. Heather is actually a professional journalist with more than 5 years of experience in the biopharmaceutical space. Since joining BioSpace, where she's currently at, she's written more than 300 feature and breaking news articles with a particular focus in neuroscience and gene therapy. And she's had a lot of international experience as well, covering global stories in the global biotech hubs in places like Israel, for example, which sounds really cool. Definitely want to hear more about that. In previous roles, she's covered current affairs, sports, education, and politics. And she's previously spent 8 years as a senior content producer for executive level business conferences in the pharma biotech space. So really excited to have Heather with us today. I think you're going to be able to bring a really unique perspective. We'll be sure to put Heather's contact information in the link below the video, so be sure to be on the lookout for that. So again, welcome, Heather, to the podcast. Really happy to have you. As the listeners know, we here bring all things and topics related to the pharma space, the biotech space, everything related to healthcare. We try to bring cutting-edge stories. And so a lot of the folks that are listening out there are executives in the pharmaceutical industry. So I really think they're going to be very excited to kind of hear your perspective, given what you do as a reporter, in terms of some of the trends that you're seeing in the biotech pharma space. So maybe we could start, Heather, and talk a little bit about some of the shifts recently in the industry. There's been a lot of things happening, as you know, globally. There's obviously global crises happening in different parts of the world. And people want to understand, how does this impact the pharmaceutical industry? And so from your perspective and your reporting, what are some of the major shifts that are happening in the industry that you think executives should be paying close attention to?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And it's actually been a pretty major shift since I started with BioSpace 5 years ago, right in the first few months of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And for a while, that was all our readers wanted. They just wanted information about COVID-19 and the vaccines that were being developed. And it was really fun to have a front row seat to that, to that, historic vaccine approval in 9 months. But today, the shift has been toward weight loss, and more weight loss,
Yep.
especially when it comes to GLP-1s. So we have a feature on this subject almost every week, and they all go gangbusters in terms of views. People are just insatiable for this knowledge. They just want more and more and more. And these drugs are so big that in 2023, the market value of Novo Nordisk, which makes Wegovy and Ozempic, surpassed the entire GDP of its home country, Denmark, and resulted in lower interest rates across the nation. So, what I'm going to say is, come on, Pfizer, let's go. We want lower interest rates too.
That is crazy, really. So they're able to impact the actual GDP for the country, and I guess the interest rate. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I worked actually years ago as a medical director in obesity. So I remember back then the Novo product didn't have an approval at that time for obesity. It was only for type 2 diabetes. And I think now, GLP-1s have really, as you've mentioned, they've taken off. What are, I guess, some of the concerns some people have about the GLP-1 users? Because it's not just Novo Nordisk, because you got Eli Lilly product, you got a product like Zepbound, you got others. But are there, any simmers of concern about the long-term use of GLP-1s, or, how it kind of fits long-term in terms of weight management and maintenance?
Yeah, I mean, there are always concerns with any drug class, right? And with this one, a lot of the concern is around the side effects. So GI side effects are the one you hear about the most, but also there have been comments about there have been reports of blindness and just different different side effects that you maybe wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
Another challenge has been the muscle loss that happens with some of these that happens with some of these. Sorry, let me. The
It's
other
okay.
challenge, the other challenge with GLP-1s has been the lean muscle loss,
Yeah.
and that's an issue especially for older patients who are already dealing with osteoporosis sometimes and those types of issues.
Yeah, the obesity market is a really interesting market. I think one of the challenges is not so much weight loss. What I saw when I worked in pharma was it really was about weight maintenance long term.
Mhm.
And that's always been the challenge in general with obesity. But even with pharmacological interventions like GLP-1s and other drugs, the issue isn't again so much the initial weight loss, it's being able to maintain that weight loss long term. And then to your point, when it comes to muscle mass loss, especially in the elderly population, that can be a concern. So it's I think it's been a very fascinating uptake. I think probably from my perspective, much more than what I had anticipated because at least when I worked in obesity, and this is going back in the year maybe 2013, 2014, there wasn't necessarily an acceptance that obesity was a disease and then
Mhm.
therefore needed pharmacological intervention, right? People saw obesity a lot of times as just a lack of will, like why can't you just stop eating type of thing. I think though, with all the work that's been done, we've become, much more knowledgeable, understand that there really is a physiological component, especially in the satiety centers in the brain. And some people struggle with that and don't feel satiated and unfortunately can overeat. So that is fascinating. Any other shifts that you've seen, that you think are important to mention?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest breakthroughs of the last decade has been the advent of immunotherapy, including checkpoint inhibitors to treat cancer. Now we're 11 years after the approval of Keytruda and Opdivo, and Biopharma is focusing on these drugs for a new target, autoimmune disease.
Hmm.
So this makes a lot of sense because immunotherapy targets diseases in which the immune system is involved in the cause, which applies to both cancer and autoimmune disease. The real interest was really sparked here by a series of small studies by George Schett of the German Center for Immunotherapy. And the first, which was published 4 years ago in 2021, treatment with a CAR T therapy targeting CD19 led to long lasting disease remission in patients with lupus, which is one of the most difficult diseases I think
Yeah.
I've read about to treat.
Yeah, yeah. Lupus has been a big challenge for the medical community for some time. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think that shift in particular, in terms of what's happening in the oncology space, is really a major shift, and hopefully opens up the door to more advanced therapies. I was having this conversation the other day with a scientist that, I think in particular neurology and oncology have been challenging for the biopharma space and finding cures for certain diseases and treatments that actually make a difference. Obviously, in oncology, survival is a big challenge. And then the question, especially I think now with everything happening with the tariffs and drug pricing and drug supply and shortages and things like that, the question of, cost benefit. And, if you're a patient and you unfortunately have cancer, what does it mean? What is it worth to have 2 months additional of survival, right, or of life? And a lot of times it's in the eye of the beholder. So I think we've made a lot of progress, but there's probably a lot to go.
I think just you mentioned cost benefit analysis. I think Europe and the UK have been struggling with that when it comes to Biogen and Eisai's Leqembi, Alzheimer's drug
Yep.
Leqembi. So I think they've gone. One of the agencies has gone back and forth on whether they're going to cover it because of the questionable efficacy. Which I
Yes.
mean, I think when I think about someone I love maybe getting Alzheimer's in the future, and my grandmother had it, so I've seen what it can do to people. I'm just happy that there is something that looks like
Yeah.
it can slightly, slow it down. I
I
think that's
agree. Yeah.
the right direction.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say I think that's a really good step in the right direction. And I wrote an editorial about this a couple of months ago. I think a lot of the the issue in pharma is momentum. You need momentum to carry these disease treatments for these diseases forward, and we've seen the same thing in, say, Duchenne muscular dystrophy and spinal muscular atrophy.
I agree with you. I think on the Leqembi side, especially, there's not a lot of options available for patients with Alzheimer's and dementia. So what do you do? And I think in that case, the whole issue of what's happening on the payer side, where they don't unfortunately want to reimburse for some of these drugs, it presents challenges. We what we do at the ACMA, we work with hundreds of pharmaceutical companies, and we see it every day. It's a really a big problem and a challenge for them from a market access perspective to try to get these medications in the hands of patients. And I'm with you. If I have a relative that has Alzheimer's and there's no other option available, why not try Leqembi, right? If there's nothing else out there. So, but I agree. I mean, Leqembi, even though I know there's been some concerns about maybe the magnitude of the efficacy, again, to your point, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah,
Let's shift. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
Do you want to say anything else? Do you want to add anything else?
I was going to mention the whole ARIA thing, but we can just kind of skip past that if you want. I was just going to say.
Go ahead. Yeah. Why don't you add it? Then we can always edit it. But go ahead and add it.
Yeah, the other challenge with these antibodies is the ARIA factor, and safety is always a concern with any drug, especially one affecting the brain. But it really comes down to diagnostics in this case to diagnose the people that are the most at risk for side effects like ARIA.
How do you think, because as I mentioned before, we have a lot of pharma execs listening to this, they're involved in, putting together a plan for commercialization and launch. What do you think, based on some of these shifts, what we've learned, what do they do to prepare effectively for launch?
In what therapeutic space? Are we still talking about Alzheimer's?
I mean, yeah, let's take Alzheimer's as an example. Like, if your second drug, let's say in this class, coming to market, what have we learned from these previous launches, let's say with Leqembi? And if you're a pharma exec out there listening to this, what can you do to better prepare for the launch? What are some of the factors you should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I think you've really got to think about infrastructure. There are infusion sites that need to be set up for a lot of these drugs, and these are new modalities. So this isn't already in place. So definitely infrastructure, education, communicating to your target patient group, and yeah, I think those would be two of the biggest that I would say. I mean, if you're a second drug, I would look at, I maybe readjust your expectations, your sales expectations as well, and maybe you can plan better in terms of that, in terms of your runway and your budget as a company, because I think Biogen and Eisai missed their targets for Leqembi at first, and they completely missed them for Aduhelm. That was just a disaster, but.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, based on the stats, almost half of drug launches fail in the first year, and yeah, it's a gamble. I mean, it's high risk, right? It's high stakes in biopharma, and the number one predictor, you mentioned it and you hit the nail on the head, is having a good infrastructure and actually a very strong medical affairs and medical science liaison team. Those that have really strong capabilities, that's the number one predictor for success. And you also mentioned this when you talk about education. So, you've got to be out there a year and a half in advance before the approval, just talking about the disease state, talking about different mechanisms. Obviously, you can't talk about the drug because it's not approved yet. However, you can talk about the disease state. You can have that free scientific exchange with a lot of the key opinion leaders and begin to create that awareness before it's even launched. So I think that's spot on. And then obviously thinking about really effective market access strategies to deal with some of the payer issues that biopharma deals with. Let's turn a little bit to regulatory trends and impact.
Sorry,
Go
can I
ahead.
just, you went on mute for a second there, for a couple of seconds. We have this thing
Oh, did I?
about say something, see something, or see something, say something. So I thought I'd warn you.
Oh, did I really? Oh, interesting. I haven't
Yeah,
pressed
great,
anything,
great
so
question. Yeah.
um, I don't know.
You
Lucy,
sounded fine on my end. There was
Oh,
no
okay.
break. So
Okay.
it might have been it's
Okay.
okay. Sometimes if your internet or individual internets are a little weird, sometimes it might cut off. But on my end it was fine and my side is recording, so we're good.
All good.
okay. All right, good to know. Yeah, because I hadn't touched any button or anything. All right, so let's turn to. Let me say that again, just for the editing. Just give it a minute. All right, let's turn to regulatory trends and their impact on the industry, Heather. Have you observed any key regulatory trends that you think could significantly impact pharma companies in the next few years? Things that you've seen?
Yeah, well, certainly there are a lot of pathways. The FDA has a lot of pathways to get drugs to the market faster for diseases with high unmet need. And there's the FDA's accelerated approval pathway allows for a drug to be approved based on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And it's helped bring nearly 300 new drugs to the market since its inception in 1992, which is really impressive. But lately, the pathway has come under fire, due especially to a couple of controversial decisions. One was to do with Aduhelm, and then Elevidys, which won, and then sorry, and then Sarepta's Elevidys, which won accelerated approval in June 2023 as the first gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And both of these decisions have come under fire over biomarkers and in terms of overall efficacy.
What do you think about some of the concerns related? You mentioned Biogen related to maybe the FDA being a little bit too close for comfort with the biopharma industry. I mean, what's your take on that? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, in terms of that one, they did seem a little bit cozy with the
Yeah.
FDA. I, overall, I don't think that's a good thing. I think in terms of market competition, I don't think that's a good thing. Was it a good thing that Aduhelm got approved? I think so, because it goes back to that momentum discussion.
Hmm.
And yes, Aduhelm was a complete failure, and hopefully Biogen isn't listening to this, but they might agree. Um, but it led to Leqembi, and
Right.
that's the important thing is that it's generating momentum in the space. But yeah, I do think that is a challenge. There's Patrizia Cavazzoni just joined Pfizer as a CMO, I believe. So there's a
Speaking
lot of revolving door stuff going on between the FDA and the pharma industry.
Well, and I was just about to ask you about that. So, the new FDA head, Marty McCary, what's your take on that in terms of how is the pharma industry reacting to his appointment by Trump? He was someone who came out of industry. I think he was working, if I remember correctly, for maybe a device company, if I remember correctly. I think it actually was in obesity, related to something like that. But he's obviously at the FDA now. How's pharma feeling about that?
In terms of pharma, I've read several analyst notes, and pharma seems to be less concerned about McCary than some of the other players, including his
Oh,
boss,
interesting.
RFK Jr. He's been very political in terms of how he's responded to the vaccine questions during his hearings, McCary, that is. But I think there's an overall view that he is going to protect the science.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it remains to be seen. So when Janet Woodcock was the FDA commissioner and I met with her a few times and she was fantastic. I know she came under fire before she left. But I can say, at least from my interactions with the FDA, they really are trying to do the right thing. I think most people are really trying to do the right thing. They're really trying to make sure that they're very diligent and comprehensive in all the reviews. And when I worked in the industry, that was my experience. So I do think I agree with you. I think some of it is political. And so I guess, it remains to be seen. But um, I think overall, the issue really stems from the fact that there seems to be, at least on RFK Jr.'s side, a level of almost suspicion of the biopharma industry, right? I think he's playing into that a little bit. And again, I'm my take as a former pharma guy is that most people in pharma, again, they're trying to do the right thing. They are being compliant. They're abiding by what they should be doing. Of course, you have a few bad apples. You have that in every industry. So I think, we've got to be balanced in our approach with some of the stuff that he says. Let's talk a little bit about investment and market trends. As you know, biotech funding's been volatile. What should pharma execs know about in terms of current investment trends and how they might impact M&A, for example, or R&D funding? What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, the last couple of years from 2024 into the beginning of 2025, we've seen a lot of bolt-on deals. So these are deals that are, five billion or less. We heard at the beginning of the year that pharma might be ready for some more mega deals, which are always fun to cover. And the year started out with J&J buying Intracellular for 14.6 billion. But since then, the appetite has been much smaller. So it really so last year, pharma did keep to this sub 5 billion range, and they seem to have been doing that this year as well, with like 3 or 4 deals this week worth, around 1 billion.
Interesting. Do you think that with everything happening, from a foreign policy perspective with the tariffs, you think that might have any impact on, I guess, how much risk companies want to take on the M&A side?
I do. I mean, I think they're reacting like the markets. They just don't know what's going on, what's going to happen.
Mhm.
And I think it's the tariffs, it's other geopolitical challenges. Though it's also just a really competitive atmosphere in so many of the therapeutic spaces right now that maybe you don't want to maybe you don't want to go completely all in, and maybe you just want to diversify. Maybe you just want to get some of these, $2-3 billion deals to help your cardio portfolio and to
Right.
help your oncology portfolio if you're a large company like Novartis or AstraZeneca or Pfizer.
Let's talk a little bit, to that point about market access and pricing. I'm sure going back to weight loss, you saw Novo's strategy where they said, you know what, we're not gonna even deal with the insurance companies if we don't have to. We're gonna give a flat price. I think it was $499 a month for
Yeah.
Wegovy and directly to patients. Um, given what's happening with pricing pressures, obviously this has always been a big issue for pharma, the trade organization. Now I'm talking about, right? Their big thing when they go lobby is, pricing, drug pricing, and also being able to get approvals more quickly. That's really their two main kind of big priorities. And mostly, like I said, it always has been. How should pharma companies, I guess, adjust some of their go-to market strategies? Do you see what Novo did as being a potential future trend for other companies because of all the pricing pressures, because of some of the challenges with market access and how insurance companies work in the US?
I do. I think Lilly did something similar with the direct to patient sales or direct to consumer sales. And I think they're not the first ones. I think there was another indication or another company that did that late last year. So I think obesity is something that is going to set the trend for sure in terms of the market. I also think that companies might want to readjust their expectations on what the Trump administration might do with the IRA. Because I think they were hoping for a lot of help, but then Trump had a meeting with Pharma and some of the Pharma, the organization, and some of the pharmaceutical leaders last month, where that did not seem to come to fruition. There was no promise to help in terms of adjusting anything with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, I think they thought he was going to peel back a lot
Mhm.
more with what the Biden administration had done with IRA
Yeah.
than what actually happened. To your point, I agree. So that'll be interesting to see how that works out. I guess I wonder with the IRA sometimes how much teeth it'll have long term. So that again, that remains to be seen for some of these companies. But I know that caused a big ruckus in the industry, in the last year or two, and many companies pulled out of pharma, the trade organization.
Yeah, we
Um,
see that trend. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. And it's, I think for sure with the IRA, I do think that small molecule penalty needs to be changed because those are really important drugs, and companies need to be incentivized to make them.
100%. Yeah, I think you're spot on. Yeah, I think, for a lot of these pharma companies, repeating what Lilly did or Nova did on the obesity side, thinking about how they go direct to patient, I think it could be, we'll see that strategy more and more happening because it's been difficult for these companies. Actually, if you look back at the American Medical Association, they had done a survey back in 2019 looking at the impact of prior authorization denials, let's say, with a lot of these drugs. It's the number one reason for care delay in the US.
Hmm.
And 1 out of 4 patients at the pharmacy counter can't get their script due to a prior auth denial. So I think that for a lot of pharma companies, bypassing that whole process is something that they're willing to do, even if it means that maybe reimbursement is a little bit lower. But it's been a challenge, and I think that there's definitely has to be a lot of reform that we need to look at for PBMs and payers and just that whole process.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
go ahead.
pricing is definitely an issue when it comes to gene therapy, which is still one of the most popular subjects with our audience, but these companies are struggling in the market. And there was Bluebird Bio, which recently avoided bankruptcy by going private. And that company's deal was pretty shocking. It was 30 million valuation, which was shocking considering that gene therapy was once the hottest thing in biopharma. But I think a lot of that is the astronomical prices of some of these therapies. I mean, there was Vertex's sickle cell gene therapy Casgevy, which cost 2.2 million, and then there's Bluebird's direct competitor to that, Lyfgenia, which is 3.1 million. So, I think market access is really something that needs to be looked at in this sector particularly.
How much responsibility, though, on the pricing do you put on pharma versus how much of it is just the system? Because, the PBMs, obviously, they get rebates based on the list price. So the higher the price of the drug, the better rebate they get. It's almost like the system is kind of rigged in such a way that the pharma companies are kind of between a rock and a hard place when it comes to pricing. How much of that you think pharma though is responsible for in terms of the high price of some of these drugs, like the gene therapy drugs?
No, I completely agree. I mean, these companies put a lot of money, an astronomical amount of money into developing these drugs, and they need to recoup that so that they can go ahead and make more important gene therapies for more diseases.
Exactly. And if people out there, who are listening, some may realize this or not, but it takes on average 10 to 15 years to bring a drug to market. That's the average time. And again, like I mentioned, it's a big gamble. It's a big risk for these companies. They're investing tons of money to get the drug to get commercialized. And so, how frustrating is it once you've gotten the drug out there, you've been able to show efficacy, and then you have a market access obstacle? I mean, that's very, very frustrating from a
Yeah,
pharma perspective.
yeah, and then this lack of profit that these gene therapies are making, it really hits the momentum in terms of other companies and in terms of investors wanting to invest in these companies.
Yeah.
And then you see what you're seeing with layoffs at different firms. There was Editus had a layoff recently, and yeah, it's a real challenge. And I think a lot of people see these $1 billion price tags and they get mad at pharma, but you've got to think about the whole system.
Agreed. Absolutely agree with you. Let's shift. Kind of the last topic I wanted to talk to you about is around just in general, biospace's kind of industry insights. So, based on your coverage, you've obviously done a lot with biospace. What's one under the radar trend you think in pharma that executives should be thinking about, but might not be? And then I guess what's next for biospace? What's long term, biospace looking to do, and kind of their long term goals?
Yeah. Let me just Well, I think certainly the gene therapy paradox is something that we've been tracking quite closely. So successful science, but market failure. And then, despite this, and despite the loss of rare disease priority review vouchers, there is a lot of I'm sorry. And then there's also the loss of priority review there's also the loss of rare disease priority review vouchers, which have been available to companies developing therapies for rare diseases. Um, and this has been a major source of cash for companies because they can either use them to invest in a future product to get a shortened time frame for a future product, or they can sell them. And Bluebird actually failed 3 times to get a PRV for one of its recent products, and that could have kept the company afloat and prevented them from having to go private. So that those kind of moves going around the rare disease space is another kind of trend that we're following.
Interesting. So you think a lot of people maybe are not familiar with that, with PRVs?
Yeah, I think outside of the rare disease space, it's a little bit unknown. But it's yeah, I mean, this program, it wasn't reauthorized by Congress despite bipartisan support, and so the program is sunsetting now. So, I think it was a really great source of investment for rare disease companies, and that's something they're going to be lacking now. And rare diseases are they're one of the critical areas that really need help. They don't make a lot of money, but they are very severe, a lot of them, and a lot of them affect children.
Absolutely. And I worked in rare disease, and it's definitely near and dear to my heart because the disease state I worked in also affected children. And you work really closely with the patient advocacy organizations and their families. And ultimately, a lot of times it's a drug that is a life-saving drug, and they need the drug. Otherwise, the effects of not taking it could be, devastating. So I think you bring up a really good point. What's next for BioSpace? Tell us a little bit about, maybe for those that aren't familiar with BioSpace, what you guys focus on, and what's hot that's next.
Yeah, well, we focus on drug development, so usually late phase drug development primarily, and of course all the regulatory and policy issues have been basically my new beat this year since Trump's inauguration. But we've been a bit under construction for the past 2 years, so we've gone from mainly covering news in aggregate form to doing a lot more in-depth reporting, which is kind of my forte here. And we're also becoming a lot more multimedia. So we have our own podcast. It's called The Weekly, where we go over the news of the week and the hottest trends. And that's just our BioSpace team editorial team. That's just our BioSpace editorial team right now, but it's possible that we could start inviting guests in the future. So this could be kind of a reverse situation for me.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I wasn't aware of that. So I'll definitely be on the lookout for that. And we'll put the link below so that people can access it. That's fantastic. I think there's a big need for it. So
Maybe we'll have you on.
congratulations. I'd love to be on. I'd love to be on. Congratulations. I think it's great that you're doing it. Like I said, I think there's a big need. And I've been familiar with BioSpace for a long time. You guys do a phenomenal job. I'm familiar with your work, and you do a great job, I think, in reporting really important information and news that people in the industry really need to know about. So kudos to you and the work that you do. Heather, it was great having you on. Heather McKenzie, everyone. Again, we'll put the link to Heather's contact information as well as the weekly podcast below in the video. Thanks again, Heather. It was great having you.
It's been fun.